Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating the pet inventory GUI. As always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified whenever I upload more Roblox development content. I also have Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I make during this episode, there's a link down below the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, let's hop right into it. Now, before we begin creating the actual GUI, as usual with most of our GUI videos during the series, there's a link down below the description that'll take you to this Patreon post, which is completely free and everybody can access it. Inside of this post, it has an attachment which contains a bunch of images which you guys can use to create your own GUIs. Now, one more time, I'd like to make clear, this is completely free and you guys can use this in your own games for free as well without any credit provided. Additionally, if you already downloaded this, the reason that I'm highlighting this once again is because we've added even more assets to this, which we're going to be using in this specific episode as well. So make sure you guys go download this once again, get all the new assets, and upload them to Studio. Now, once we're in Studio, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the Star GUI, go to the random gift GUI, and we're going to set that to no longer be enabled so we don't see that GUI. Then inside of the Star GUI, we're going to create a brand new screen GUI, and we're going to rename this to Pet Inventory. We also want to make sure that we set reset on spawn to false, and then inside of the screen GUI, we're going to add a frame. Now that we have that frame, what we then want to do is adjust the size. For the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.3, and then for the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.5 for right now, and then we want to center this. To center this, we're going to adjust the anchor point on both the X and the Y to 0.5, and then for the position, we're going to set the X scaled and the Y scaled to both 0.5 as well, and now it's centered on our screen. Then we want to select our frame, we want to go to the plugins tab, and you should have the auto scale Lite plugin already installed. If you don't, there's a link down below the description, and once you have this plugin, you're going to want to make sure you have the frame selected and then click on add constraint, which will add a UI aspect ratio constraint to this frame. Now, the reason that we're doing that is because let's just say, for instance, if we open up the asset manager or anything like that, we want to make sure that we have a UI aspect ratio constraint inside of this so that it basically locks the aspect ratio and it doesn't get messed up if we accidentally have other tabs open, which will adjust the screen size and stuff like that. That's why we're adding a UI aspect ratio off the start. Now that we have the UI aspect ratio, let's go ahead and add a UI corner to this frame, and we're going to set this to 0.025, and now we can see that the corners have been rounded. We then want to modify the background color of this frame, and we're going to set it to a light blue, just like that. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to add the title text label. We're actually going to go inside of the reverse GUI, inside of the frame, and then we're going to grab this title text label right here. We're going to copy it by hitting Control-C on it, and then we're going to paste it directly into this frame by hitting Control-Shift-V, and now it's pasted directly into this frame. Now, for the sizing of this text label, realistically, we just want to make it smaller on the Y-axis. The X-axis doesn't really matter too much for us. So for the size, the X is going to be 0.39, and the Y scale is going to be 0.067, just like that. Now, we also might want to move this up a tiny bit, so we're going to adjust the Y scale, and instead of saying 0.031, we're going to say 0.021, so move it up just a tiny bit, and now that looks pretty good. Of course, we need to make sure that we actually change the text of this text label. Instead of saying rebirth, we want to say pets, just like that. Also, I'm going to readjust my camera a little bit because this can be a little bit hard to create when you have a blue background behind your background frame, so we're going to look down, and now the color is a little bit different, so it's easier to work with. Next, what we'll do is inside of this frame, we're going to create a brand new frame, and we're going to rename this one to holder. Now, for the background color, we're actually going to change this, and it's going to be a little bit of a darker blue, so just like that. For the sizing, we of course want to set this to scaled, so for right now, we might set this to like 0.95 on the X and maybe 0.5 on the Y. The Y doesn't really matter right now, but that looks pretty good. For the position, we want to make sure that we center this on the X-axis, so we're going to set the anchor point on the X and the position to 0.5, just like that. Then we want to bring this down a little bit, and we pretty much want to bring it down almost to when it's touching the bottom, so even right there is pretty good. And then we want to extend this upwards a little bit. That might be good. We'll definitely readjust this once we start adding other things to this GUI, but we just want to have this put down for right now. We're going to expand this out a little bit because it's basically almost touching all of the edges, but there's still a little gap between them, so that might be good. Let's make sure that it's centered once again on the X-axis, so there we go, perfectly centered, and we might bring it down just a tiny bit more, so maybe like that. That might be fine. We of course want to throw a UI corner inside of this holder frame as well, so let's go ahead and maybe try to set that to like 0.1. That is way too rounded, so maybe 0.025. I think that looks pretty good. Once again, inside of a rebirth GUI, inside of the frame, we have a text button actually called exit. We're going to once again copy that, and then we're going to paste that directly inside of our frame, inside of the pet inventory. Now we have our exit button right here. Now we want to resize this a little bit. I think I might just make it like a tiny bit smaller, something like that. Also, let's move this over just a tiny bit. So I'm going to stretch it over to there and then make it a tiny bit smaller. So I think that looks pretty good. And if you're wondering the sizing, that's the sizing and that's the positioning right there. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this holder frame and we're going to rename this to total. The reason that we're duplicating that frame is because it already has a lot of the properties that we need set on it. So that's why we're just duplicating it instead of creating a brand new one and setting all of the same properties that we're already going to have set for us. Then what we want to do is we actually want to make this frame be a little bit of a square up here. Now that actually might be good like that, but we might want to make it smaller. So I don't know. We'll try it like that for right now. Then inside of the total frame, we want to adjust the UI corner since this is a little bit larger. Let's try like 0.1. I think that actually looks pretty good. Maybe like 0.15. 0.75 if you want it a little bit more round. There we go. Then what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this title text label, bring that inside of the total frame. For the size of this, at least on the X, we're going to set that to 0.95, so that's pretty much the entire X axis. And then for the Y, we're going to set this to about 0.35, so there we go. And then we actually want to modify the text, and what we want this to say is total pet bonus. Just like that. Actually, my mistake. It should say total pets bonus. So plural on the pets. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a frame inside of this total frame, and we're going to rename this to clicks. Now, for the size of this frame, once again, on the X-axis, it's going to be 0.95. And for the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.275, just like that. Then what we're going to want to do is inside of the total frame, we want to actually add a UI list layout to this. Inside of the UI list layout, we want to modify some of the properties. So for instance, the horizontal alignment, we actually want to set that to center. And then we can go ahead and modify the padding. Let's go ahead and set this to 0.025. So we add a little bit of spacing between them, and that seems pretty good. Then inside of the clicks frame, we actually want to add an image label, and then we're going to rename this image label to icon. Then for the background transparency, we want to set that to 1. For the scale type, we want to set this to fit. Then for the size, we want to set the X scale to 0.2 and 1 on the Y axis. Then we actually have to modify the image. For the image, we're going to go inside of the view tab. We're going to go inside of our asset manager, open up our images, and inside of here, we want to grab the clicks boost icon. So we're going to copy the ID to clipboard, and then we're going to paste that image directly right there. Now that we have that image, what we're then going to do is we're going to duplicate this title text label, bring that inside of clicks. We'll rename this text label to amount. We then want to modify the size of this text label. So on the X scale, we actually want to set that to 0.75. And on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.1, just like that. Then we want to adjust the position. So we're going to set the anchor point to 0. And for the position, on the X scale, we want to set that to 0.25. And on the Y scale, we're just going to set that to 0. So there we go. We also then want to modify the text color. And we actually want to set it to a yellow color, just like that. Then for the clicks frame, we want to actually set the background transparency to 1. And now we can see that. Also, we of course want to make sure that we adjust the text label. And for right now, we're going to say X100M clicks, just like that. We also want to make sure that we set the text X alignment to left so that it appears towards the left rather than being centered. Then what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this clicks frame right here, and we're going to rename this to auto. Then inside of here, we actually want to change the text label text color, and we want to set that back to white. For the text, we actually want to say plus 99.99m/SEC. That stands for seconds. There we go. And then we also want to modify the image label as well. So let's go back into view, open up our asset manager, and grab the clicker button icon. Copy that ID, set the image just like that, and there we go. Now we're pretty much done with the total frame, so we can go ahead and minimize that. Next, we're going to create the search bar. Now to do this, we're going to once again duplicate the holder frame, and we're going to rename this to search. Then we're of course going to resize this a little bit. Now the search bar is basically going to be right underneath of the title label, so that's why we're resizing it to be like right up to here, and we're going to make it a little bit smaller. There we go. Now if you're curious about the sizing for the search bar, this is what we have it on currently, and for the position, it is centered on the X-axis, so that's what it looks like right here. Now inside of the search frame, we actually have a UI corner, and for some reason there's a black border around this frame right here, and I believe the reason for that is because the corner radius might not be large enough, which I think might be a visual glitch in Roblox Studio, but I could be wrong. So what we're going to do is we're just going to actually adjust the corner radius a little bit. So now we can see that we set it to 0.1, that border actually disappears, but we might want it to be a little bit more round, so we can set it to like 0.15 and keep increasing it if you want it more round. Anyways, what we're then going to do is inside of this frame, we want to add a text box, and we're also going to rename this to search as well. For the size of this, we're going to set it to 0.9 on the X and the Y, just like that. And then we want to make sure that we center it as well, so 0.5 on both the X and the Y axis, just like that. For the text box, we'll also set the background transparency to 1. For the actual text, we're going to set that to white. We want to make sure that we have the text scaled. For the font, we of course are going to go with the Gotham. We also want to make sure that we modify the placeholder text color. We want it to actually be a little bit more of a gray because that's just how they have it. For the placeholder text, we actually want to type in search ... just like that. And for the text property, we're just going to set that to nothing. So there we go. We'll also set the text X alignment to left, just like that. And now that's looking pretty good. One last thing I'm going to do is adjust the placeholder color to make it just a little bit brighter, and I think that looks better. Then what we're going to do is we're actually going to duplicate the total frame, and we're going to rename this to storage. Then we'll go ahead and reposition this over on the left side, so we'll just say like 0.2 for right now. And then we're going to just kind of resize this frame a little bit, so I think that probably is even good right there. Inside of this frame, we can actually delete the UI corner and the title text label. Then what we're going to do is we're going to rename auto to equipped, and then we're going to delete the text frame just like that. Now for the sizing of this equipped frame, we're actually going to set the X scale to 1 and the Y scale to 0.5. Inside of this frame, we want to go ahead and modify the icon, so we're actually going to change the image, and we want to set that to the pet icon that has a little paw print just like that. We're also going to go inside of the amount text label, and we want to set that to 3/3 just like that. We can also modify the alignment of this, so rather than being left, we can just set that to center, and we can also adjust the sizing of this as well. Rather than actually setting the sizing, let's just make it a little bit smaller, and I think that looks pretty good. Now for the position of this, I think we're actually going to set it to like 0.21, so there's just a small space between this text label and this image. image label. Then what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a text button inside of here, and we're going to rename this to buy. Now for the background color, we're actually going to set this to a purple, just like that. For the text, we're actually just going to set this to a plus. For the text color, we're going to set that to white. We're going to make sure that the text is scaled. We'll make sure that the font is Gotham, and we want that to be bold. For the size, we're going to set that to 0.2 on the X and 1 on the Y. Now that we have that, what we're then going to do is we're actually going to add a UI list layout to this as well. For the UI list layout, we have to make a few changes. So instead of the fill direction being vertical, we actually want it to be horizontal. We'll also set the vertical alignment to be center, and the horizontal alignment, we're going to leave that at left. And then we want to adjust the padding so there can be some spaces between all of our elements, and we're going to set that to like 0.05, and that looks pretty good. Then what we want to do is inside of this buy button, we actually want to add a UI corner to this as well. And we'll set the corner radius to maybe 0.2, maybe 0.25. I think both of those look pretty good. We'll also make this button slightly smaller on the x-axis. So instead of 0.2, we'll maybe do 0.175, and I think that's great. Now for the actual background transparency of the storage frame, we're going to set that to 1 because we don't want there to actually be any background. Now we're pretty much done with this equipped frame. What we're then going to do is duplicate it one time, and then we're going to rename it to stored. Now for the icon, we actually want to adjust the image to be our storage icon, just like that. For the amount text, instead of it saying 3/3, we actually want to say 100/100. And then what we're also going to do is actually increase the size of the amount text label. So on the x-axis, instead of being 0.256, we'll try it at maybe 0.3. I think 0.4 is pretty good. If you take a look at that, that looks pretty good to me. Okay, so now that we're done with the stored frame, we're pretty much done with this whole storage frame as well. Next, what we're going to do is go inside of the holder frame and add a brand new frame inside of this, and we're going to rename this to buttons. Now, for the size of this frame, at least on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.95, and on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 0.1 for right now. Then we want to make sure that we center this on the X axis. So there we go. And then we're just going to position this towards the very bottom of the frame, just like that. What we're then going to do is duplicate this frame, and we'll actually rename this one to info. And then we're going to resize this a little bit. We actually want this to be like a rectangle on the left side of the holder, and we want it to come pretty close to the buttons frame, and I think that looks pretty good. And then we're going to add one more frame inside of this holder, but instead of a normal frame, we actually want to get a scrolling frame. Then of course we want to make sure that we set the size to scale, so there we go. And then we're going to reposition this a little bit and drag it out just like that. Now, considering how our frames are currently set up and how they look, I would recommend to make any adjustments that you actually want to before we start creating all of the individual things inside of them. So for instance, if we want this scrolling frame to be a little bit larger, like we actually want it to extend very far to the right, but basically almost touching that right-hand side, then we should probably increase the sizing in that regard. Or if we want to do the same thing for the info frame or the buttons frame, maybe we want to move the buttons frame up a little bit. We should do all of that right now. And then once you're all set in stone with all those things, then we can move on to the next steps. Now, honestly, I think that looks fine for right now. Maybe we'll make some adjustments once we're done actually creating the frames, but I figured I'd lay it out all for you so that you can decide what you guys want to do. Anyways, what we're then going to do is rename the scrolling frame to container, and then we'll actually get started on working on the buttons frame. What we want to do inside of here is we want to actually add a UI grid layout to this. Now, inside of this frame, we want to basically be able to fit about 4 buttons inside of here. So for when it comes to the UI grid layout, according to how many buttons we want to have displayed in here, that's how we have to set the cell sizing. So for the cell sizing on the x-axis, we're going to set that to 0.235, and on the y, we're going to set that to 1, just like that. For the cell padding, for right now, we're just going to set that all to 0. For the horizontal alignment, we're actually going to set that to center, and for the vertical alignment, we'll also set that to center as well. All right, so now that we got the UI grid layout set up, let's go ahead and add a text button to the buttons frame and start creating our first button. Let's go ahead and rename this text button to unequip all. Then for the text of this actual button is going to be set to blank. The background color is going to be purple, so there we go. Then what we'll do is inside of this button, let's go ahead and add a UI corner to this. For the corner radius, we're going to try a 0.2, and that looks pretty good. Then let's go ahead and throw an image label inside of this button as well. We're going to rename this to icon. For the size on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.2, and on the Y scale, we'll do 0.8. Then we want to make sure that we center this vertically, so we're going to say 0.5 for the anchor point and position on the Y axis. Looking at the icon, we also want to move this just a little bit from the left side of the button. So for the positioning on the X scaled, we're actually going to set this to 0.025, and now it appears just a little bit from the left-hand side of the button. Then let's also adjust the scale type property to be fit, and now we can change the image as well. Now for this image, we're actually going to be using the pet icon, and then we want to make sure the background transparency is 1, and now we can actually see that image, and it's all looking good. So next, what we're going to do is actually duplicate this title text label that we have and bring that inside of the button. For the size of this, we're actually going to set it to 0.7 on the x-axis, and then 1 on the y-axis. For the positioning, we're actually going to set 0, 0 for the anchor point, and for the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.25, and for the Y, we're going to set that to 0. Then let's go ahead and actually adjust the text. We want this to say unequip space all, just like that. Now that button's looking pretty good. The text is positioned nicely with the icon. So we're done with that button. Let's go ahead and duplicate this and create our next one. Our next one is actually going to be called mass delete. The background color of this one is going to be a little bit of a lighter red, so we'll go ahead and grab that color. For the text of the title label, this of course should actually say mass delete. For the icon, let's go ahead and update the image. We're going to use the trash full icon right here. So there we go. We can then duplicate this button, and then we'll rename it to equip best. For the background color of this, it is going to be a little bit of a darker blue. There we go. Of course, let's go ahead and adjust the text to say equip best. For the icon, let's go ahead and update that image. For this image, we're going to use the magnet icon. Then we can duplicate that button, rename this one to trash mode. The background color of this is going to be a little bit of a darker red, so let's go ahead and just make it like that. For the text of the title label, we're going to say trash mode. And for the icon, let's go ahead and adjust the image. And with this image, we're actually going to use the real trash icon, just like that. Now that we have all the buttons created, we should go look back at our UI grid layout, and we should actually adjust the cell padding for this. So for the cell padding, we want to add a little bit more spacing in between them. So we're going to say 0.015, and now we can see that is pretty nice spacing, and they're not appearing outside of the frame or anything else like that. So I think that looks pretty good. What we can then do is adjust the background transparency of the buns frame to 1, so we no longer see that white background behind the buns, and now the buns are looking pretty good. Now that we're done with the buns frame, we can actually go ahead and move on to the info frame. Once again, let's go ahead and duplicate this title text label, bring that inside of the info frame, and rename this to pet name. Now for the text, we're just going to use a random long name, so Shy Sea Turtle, just like that. For the size of the text label, we're going to set it to 0.9 on the x-axis, and we're just going to leave the Y for how it is right now. Let's also go ahead and update the background color of this info frame. It should be a little bit of a darker blue, just like that. And now we can actually see our pet name right there. Additionally, let's go ahead and throw a UI corner inside of this info frame, and I think 0.025 looks fine on that. What we can then do is insert a text box into this frame as well. Instead of renaming it, we'll leave it called text box, but let's go ahead and adjust the sizing so that it's set to scale. Now, what we actually want to do is we want to copy all the size and position properties from the pet name text label and put them into this text box. So let's go ahead and grab the position, grab the size and everything else like that, and then paste that directly into the text box so that they perfectly line up. And there we go. Now for the background transparency of the text box, we're going to set that to 1. For the placeholder text, we're not going to set any placeholder text, and we're also not going to set any text by default as well. Let's go ahead and set the text color to white. Let's set the text to scaled, and then let's also set the font to Gotham. And you can make it bold if you want or leave it as is. Now what this text box is actually going to be used for is when we go to rename our pet. So by default, let's just go ahead and make this not visible so the player doesn't actually see it, and then we'll activate it whenever the player is renaming their pet. Next, what we're going to do is throw in a viewport frame into the info frame, and of course we need to adjust the sizing. Now we have that as scaled, so let's go ahead, bring this down a little bit, and then resize it manually. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and make sure we center this on the x-axis. So there we go. Now inside of the viewport frame, we want to actually add an image label to this. For the first image label, we're going to rename this to lock. Of course, for the background transparency, set that to 1. For the image, we're actually going to use this unlocked icon right here. Of course, for the scale type, we want to set that to fit, and then we need to readjust the sizing so that it is scaled. Now for the sizing of this, let's actually go ahead and set on the x-axis to 0.15, and on the y, we're going to do 0.4. Then we want to move this to the bottom left-hand corner of this viewport frame right here. And now if we look at the image, it looks pretty good, but we want this to appear a little bit from the bottom and maybe even a little bit more from the left side as well. So adjusting the position, we can set this at like maybe 0.05 on the x, and then for the y, maybe we'll just do like 0.55, and that looks pretty good. Then we'll go ahead and duplicate this. We'll change the image, and this time we actually want the pencil icon. We'll then go ahead and rename it, and we're just going to rename it to rename. Then for the positioning of this, we want this to appear toward the right side of the viewport frame, so let's go ahead and adjust the positioning, and we're going to set this to 0.825, and that looks good, but it looks slightly closer to the right than the icon on the left does, so maybe 0.82 instead, and now I think that's good. Now we're done with adding things to the viewport frame. What we're then going to do is duplicate the pet name label. We're going to rename this to level. For the text, we're actually going to say level 100. For the text X alignment, we're going to change that to left, and now let's bring this down here just below the viewport frame and make this text a little bit smaller. So there we go. Now, depending on how you guys are feeling, you might want this to be the same width of this viewport frame, or you might want it to be a little bit larger, so you can decide on how you want to do that. Then what we'll do is add a frame inside of the info frame, and we're going to rename this to progress bar. For the background color, it's actually going to be a little bit of a darker blue. We, of course, want to make sure that the sizing is set to scale, and there we go. And then let's drag this directly underneath of the level label and make this a little bit smaller. So there we go. Then what we're going to do is throw a UI corner inside of here. For this corner radius, we're going to try 0.5, and that's a little bit too curved, so maybe 0.25. I think actually 0.3 is pretty good, so there we go. Next, what we're going to do is duplicate the level text label and bring that inside of the progress bar. For the size, we're going to say 0.9 on the X and 0.8 on the Y. For the position, we want this to be on the left side, but centered vertically, so we're going to set 0.5 for the Y and 0.5 for the position right there as well. And now for the position on the X-axis, we're going to try 0.05 to make this just appear a little bit from the left side, and that looks pretty good. Then what we're going to do is rename this text label to amount, and the actual text should say something like 1000/1000, just like that. Then what we'll do is duplicate this progress bar, put it inside of itself, rename this to progress. The background color of this should actually be a little bit of a lighter blue, so there we go. The size of this, for right now, we're going to set this to like 0.75, and on the Y, we want it to be the full height of that, so there we go. For the position, everything is going to be set to 0. We'll also delete the text label inside of that, and now we have the progress bar, but of course we can't actually see this text over top of it. So what we want to do is check the z-index of this progress bar. We can see that that's 1, so we want to set the z-index of this progress frame to 2, and then for the z-index of the amount label, we want to actually set that to 3, and now the text is appearing over top of that label, and that's looking good. We also might want to make this progress bar just a little bit thinner, so maybe even something like that. The text is also a little bit hard to see, so what we're going to do is actually give it a little bit of stroke, so we're going to reduce the transparency to maybe 0.6, and now that definitely looks better. Next, what we're going to do is throw another frame inside of here, and we're going to rename this to stats. For the size, of course, we're going to need that to be scaled. Then let's go ahead and reposition this down here. Now with this frame, we actually want to be able to fit 2 frames inside of this info frame that are pretty much the exact same size, because we still need to display all the stats that each pet has individually, and then we also want to display a couple of buttons down here as well, such as locking their pet, equipping the pet, or even converting it to a shiny. So for the sizing of this, we might be able to get away with 0.225 vertically, and then if we duplicate it and move it a little bit further down, we can see that they still do fit inside of here, so I think that works. So for the sizing, like I said, this is going to be the sizing right here. Then inside of the stats frame, let's go ahead and throw a UI grid layout to here, and then let's also throw a frame inside of here as well. Now, with the UI grid layout, for the cell size, we want all the stats to be the entire width, and we're going to have about 3 stats, so we're going to do 0.3 for the height, just like that, and then for cell padding, we're just going to set that all to 0 for right now. Then what we're going to do is rename this frame to auto. The background transparency, that's going to be set to 1. Then what we're going to do is inside of our total frame, we have this auto frame right here, which has an icon and an amount. We're just going to go ahead, copy both of those, and paste those directly into the auto frame right here. Now that we have that, it is a little bit hard to see, but let's actually go ahead and adjust the background color of stats just to a different random color so we can actually still see it. And now that we see that, that actually looks good. What we're then going to do is duplicate this auto frame and rename this to clicks. Then we can go back down to this clicks frame right here, go ahead and grab both of the text label and the image label and paste them directly into this clicks frame right here. We'll go ahead and modify this amount text label. Instead of saying X100M clicks, it'll actually just say X100M, and there we go. And then finally, we're going to duplicate the clicks frame, rename this to exists. For the image of this icon, we're actually going to use this star icon right there. And then for the amount, it should actually say something like 999,999 exist. Just like that. And then we're also going to want to change the text color of this text to be a little bit more of an orange, but let's actually just go ahead and use the same exact color of that icon. So there we go. Then what we can do is with the stats frame, set the background transparency to 1. And I didn't realize, but we accidentally duplicated this earlier and forgot to delete it. So let's go ahead and delete that. And now that's looking pretty good. What we can then do is duplicate this stats frame. And I'm actually going to set the background transparency to 0, just so that we can easily move this down and resize it if we need to. So there we go. Then what I'm going to do is rename this from stats to buttons. I'm going to delete all of these frames right there. If we look at the UI grid layout, we really don't have to make any adjustments to this because we still just want to fit 3 elements inside of here, so we can still leave that at 0.3. What we'll then do is throw a text button inside of here. We'll rename this to equip. The background color of this should actually be a purple, and it's going to match that unequip all button, just like that. For the text, of course, we can just say equip. We want to make sure that the text is scaled. The text color should be white, and the font should, of course, be Gotham, maybe even bold if that's what you want to do. Additionally, we're going to go ahead and throw a UI corner inside of that equip button, and we'll try the corner radius at about 0.35, and that looks pretty good. Then what we'll do is duplicate this equip button, rename it to shiny. For the text, we're going to say shiny, and then in parentheses 2/5, and then another parenthesis, just like that. The background color of this should be gray, so there we go. Then let's duplicate this one more time, rename this to delete, and we're going to set the background color of this to be a little bit of a red, and then we will, of course, want to make sure that we set the text to say delete, just like that. Then for the buttons frame, we actually can set the background transparency to 1 because we now have them all lined up, and they're all looking pretty good. We can also adjust the cell padding a little bit, so we can say 0.05, and now there's a little bit of space in between them. And if we wanted to, we could also do that with the stats frame as well. But honestly, the spacing for the stats seems fine to me. So if you guys want to make that adjustment on your own, you definitely can. Also, I don't think we centered the stats or the buns frame. So let's go ahead and make sure that we center them horizontally. So we got the stats frame, and let's make sure that we get the buns frame as well. So 0.5 and 0.5. There we go. Okay, so now we're pretty much done with the info frame. Time to start working on the container. For the container, we're not actually going to have any background. So we're going to set the background transparency to 1. For the scroll bar thickness, we'll try that at about an 8. For the scroll bar image color, let's go ahead and make that like a brighter gray, kind of like a whitish color. So there we go. We'll also make sure that we set the border size pixel of this scrolling frame to 0 so we don't see that black line right there. Then what we can do is throw a text button inside of the container. We'll rename this to template. We'll also want to throw a UI grid layout inside of here as well. Now for the UI grid layout, we want to be able to fit 4 pets in each column. So for the cell size on the x-axis, we got to set that to 0.225, and on the y, we're going to set that to 0.125, just like that. Additionally, you might want to adjust the horizontal alignment to be center. Some people prefer when the pets appear on the left. I like center. You guys can do it however you want to. And then let's also set the cell padding to 0 for right now as well, just like that. Next, for the template. For the background color of this, we want to make it a lighter blue. For the text, we're actually going to set that to blank. Then, of course, we want to throw a UI corner inside of here. For the radius, we're going to set that to 0.1. Then let's go ahead, duplicate this title text label, throw that inside of the button. For the size of this on the x-axis, let's go ahead and make that 0.9 and maybe 0.2 on the y. We want to center this horizontally, which it actually appears to be already. And I don't really think we need to adjust the y at all because I think think that looks fine right there. For the text, let's go ahead and set this to Shy Sea Turtle so we can see what a long name looks like, and that appears to be fine. Let's make sure that we rename this title text label to say pet name, and then we're going to duplicate this and say clicks. Now for the text of this, we should say something like 999.99M. For the text color of that, we want it to be a little bit more of a yellow, so let's go ahead and do that. And then we want to position this towards the bottom. I think on the Y, 0.8 might be fine. So now when you look at that, that looks pretty good. You might want to make this text label a little bit bigger. It seems like they might have done that as well, but of course you can decide that on your own. I think that looks pretty good just like that. We also want to throw a viewport frame inside of this as well so that we can actually display the pet. For the size on the X and the Y, I would do anywhere between 0.8 and 0.9 because you don't want this to be the same exact size as your entire button, because otherwise it might look a little bit weird and then the clicks and the pet name would appear over top of it. So maybe even 0.85, 0, 0.85, 0, and then we're going to want to center that as well. So 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, just like that. Now, like I was saying, with the sizing, even at 0.85 right now, it still appears over top of the clicks and the pet name. Rather than making smaller though, what I'm going to do is just adjust the Z index to make the Z index of both of these text labels higher than the Z index of the viewport frame. So there we go. Let's also make sure that we set the background transparency of the viewport frame to 1. Then let's go ahead and throw an image label inside of here. We're going to rename this to equipped. For the actual image, we want to go ahead and grab that check mark icon right there. For the background transparency, set that to 1. For the scale type, set that to fit. For the size, I don't know, let's try like 0.2, 0, 0.2, 0. Now it does look good, but it is appearing below the text label, and I think I would rather have this appear above the text label. So let's go ahead and adjust the Z index, and now that's appearing above the text label. You guys might not like this, how either the name or the check mark is overlapping each other. Of course, if you guys don't like that, you can adjust the X sizing of the pet name text label to make it a little bit smaller so they don't overlap each other, but that is how they have it in Clicking Simulator. I'm not a fan of it either, but we're just kind of following along with what they're doing, and you can make your own changes if you want to. Now we got to do one more thing with this template. Go ahead and duplicate the clicks text label, rename this to selected. For the actual text, we're going to just say X, and the text color should be a bright red, just like that. For the size, we want to make this a little bit large because whenever a player selects a pet to delete, this is how we're going to mark them basically. So now the size is a little bit larger. Let's go ahead and center this on the X and the Y, just like that. And I think that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and set selected to not be visible. Let's also make sure the Z index is bigger than 1, which it is 2, so that's good. It'll always appear over top of the viewport frame, so that's great. And now if we want to, we can duplicate this template a couple of times and see how it appears, and it is looking pretty nice, but we of course want to go ahead and adjust the padding a little bit. So for the cell padding on the X, let's go ahead and try 0.025, and for the Y, we just want to add a tiny spacing to it, so maybe 0.01, just like that. And now the spacing is looking pretty good. Additionally, if you don't like how the scroll bar kind of appears to be over top of these templates, what you can do is go into the container and adjust the vertical scroll bar inset property to be always, or maybe even just scroll bar. And now we can see that they appear slightly to the left of the scroll bar, and I think that does make them look a little bit better. Then what we can do is delete all of these templates except for one. And honestly, with the container frame, I might drag this out to just be a tiny bit larger so that it appears a little bit closer to that right-hand side right there. So there we go. We adjusted the sizing to 0.615, and now I think that looks better. We could also do the same a little bit with this info frame, so just drag it over a tiny bit. There we go. And if you want to, you could also do the same thing with the buttons, make them the same exact size as everything else that we've just modified. And let's make sure that the buttons are centered still. So 0.5, 0.5. There we go. Now we're pretty much done with everything inside of this actual frame right here. What we then want to do is add another frame, and we're going to rename this to warning. We'll go ahead and adjust the sizing, of course, to make sure that it is scaled. And for this one, it's just going to be a small frame. 0.2 by 0.2 might even be fine, just like that. Let's, of course, make sure that we center it. So 0.5, 0.5, 0, 0.5, 0, just like that. We'll throw a UI corner inside of this as well. We'll set that to maybe 0.1. I think that looks good. Then from the other frame, we're going to go ahead, grab the title text label, bring that inside of here. The text of this should be warning in all capital letters. The text color should actually be red. So I think that red looks pretty good. For the background color of that frame, we actually want it to be a blue. So there we go. Let's go ahead and make that text label a little bit larger. I think that looks great. Then what we're going to do, duplicate that title text label again. This time rename it to subtitle. The text of this should actually say, "Are you sure you want to delete 100 pets?" Question mark, and in parentheses, unlocked and unequipped. Parenthesis, just like that. The text color of this should be white. So let's go ahead and do that and resize this text. So resize that text a little bit more. And there we go. Let's center this horizontally. So there we go. We might even want to move it down just slightly. So 0.225. Actually, let's make this just a tiny bit smaller. So there we go. Then what we want to do is throw some text buttons inside of here. So there we go. And we're going to rename this to back. For the background color of this, it should be a green. So just like that. For the text, it's going to say back. The text color should be white. Text should be scaled. The font, of course, Gotham, and we'll make that a bold. And then inside of this button, let's go ahead and throw in a UI corner to this. We'll just set this to like 0.1 for right now. And now let's go ahead and resize this, of course, to make it scaled. So 0.2, 0.2. There we go. Drag this down a little bit. Now we're going to reposition this button as well, make it change its size. We also want to make this just a tiny bit smaller as well. It might be just easier to adjust it here. So 475. That looks better. That gives us a little bit more room with the buttons. Let's drag this out a little bit. So now we have our back button. Let's go ahead and duplicate that, move that over here a little bit. We'll rename this one to delete. The background color of this should be a nice little red. So there we go. The actual text, of course, should say delete. And now those buttons are looking good, but let's actually adjust the UI corner of this a little bit. So maybe like 0.2 instead to make them a little bit more rounded. And now that's looking pretty good. I think for the actual UI corner of this warning frame, we might want to make it like 0.05 to make it just slightly less rounded. And I think that's looking pretty good. And with that being created, we can go ahead and set the visibility of the warning frame to false so that we no longer see it. And now we're pretty much done with creating this GUI. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you guys did enjoy it, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified whenever I upload more Roblox film and content. Also, a Patreon if you guys like to support me and get access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.